What's up, Flannelverse? Here to do a quick breakdown of the Bears-Jaguars Sunday morning football game in London. This should be a short one, trying to keep this one under half an hour, trying to do just a quick breakdown. I have a wedding tonight, so not going to be doing a live show on this game, but wanted to put something out there. Just going to do a quick look at the usage trends of both of these teams, the defensive matchups, that kind of stuff. Probably going to limit the analysis somewhat, but we'll get into it a little bit. But again, as usual, going to be going position by position: quarterback, running back, receiver, tight end, defenses, and kickers. Not going to be taking any questions, obviously, because this is not live. Maybe I'll build a lineup if I have time at the end. But mostly just breaking it down. While you're coming in, please like the video, subscribe to the YouTube channel if you haven't already done so. As you can see at the bottom of the screen, trying to get to 5,000 subscribers by the end of the NFL season. Have a ways to go. Your support is very much appreciated. So if you wouldn't mind, please click that subscribe button. All right, let's go. Let's break down this game. We're going to start, at the quarterback position. And by the way, this is what I'm using right here. This is Lineup HQ on RotoGrinders. If you want access to RotoGrinders, you get $10 off the NFL package. The link is in the description of this video. Everything else that I'm going to be using today is fantasy points. Most of it is in the fantasy points data suite. Some of it is outside the data suite, but you can get access to all of this using promo code Flannelman. You get 25% off anything at fantasy points as well. So if you're interested, check that out. The links are in the description of this video. All right, starting at quarterback, Caleb Williams, Trevor Lawrence. Caleb Williams projecting significantly better than Trevor Lawrence, 18.5 fantasy points at 8,800. Trevor Lawrence, 15.7 at 8,600. Looking at RotoGrinders, also has Caleb Williams projected better, 18.7. Trevor Lawrence at 17 fantasy points. So Caleb Williams slightly more expensive, but does project significantly better than Trevor Lawrence. Also getting pretty similar ownership. So Caleb Williams coming in at 47% ownership, Trevor Lawrence 48%. A little bit surprising to see that Trevor Lawrence is coming in at higher ownership at the lower projection, but he is a little bit cheaper, I guess. And at captain, we have Trevor Lawrence, 15% projected ownership, Caleb Williams, 16% projected ownership. So both getting some ownership at captain, good amount at flex, both pretty chalky, a little bit chalkier than I think I would like. Let's take a look at the matchup data. So in terms of schedule adjusted fantasy points allowed, this really stands out. You don't really see this kind of disparity often. You can see best possible matchup for Caleb Williams as far as schedule adjusted fantasy points allowed by the Jacksonville defense to quarterback so far this year. Jacksonville has allowed the most schedule adjusted fantasy points to quarterback so far this year. And then the other end of the spectrum, Chicago has allowed the least. So you're never going to see a disparity obviously bigger than this. The most to the least, best possible matchup for Caleb Williams, worst possible matchup for Trevor Lawrence. So all of that considered, factoring in the matchup, I'm going to like Caleb Williams better, coming in at lower ownership than Trevor Lawrence. Much better matchup. Trevor Lawrence, probably better quarterback at this stage of their careers, but I don't even think that's a sure thing. You can say that with any certainty. I'll lean into the Caleb Williams side of this. If they're going to be getting similar ownership, I will probably just go overweight Caleb Williams, underweight Trevor Lawrence. Honestly, might just go underweight both of them, but more significantly to Trevor Lawrence. Now, this is worth noting. It is a technically a home game for the Jaguars. Trevor Lawrence, not his first London game. So maybe a little bit of an advantage there just in terms of experience playing abroad in London for Trevor Lawrence. That is something in favor of the Jaguars here. But much better matchup for Caleb Williams. If I'm playing either of them, I'm stacking them up regardless of where I have them in the lineup. Both of these quarterbacks are like mediocre running quarterbacks, certainly not elite, not total statues either. I would prefer to have them at least double stacked when I have them in the captain spot. You could maybe get away with single stacking them in the captain spot, but I think in general, unless you're 150 max and if you're just like hand building, I would prefer to have either of these quarterbacks double stacked if I have them in the captain spot because of the nature of scoring, where the pass catcher outscores the quarterback on every single passing play on actually both DraftKings and FanDuel. Probably if they're going to be the optimal captain, you're going to want these quarterbacks stacked with multiple partners when they're in the captain spot. As far as my analysis goes, worth pointing out here that all of my analysis is going to be assuming large field GPPs. You obviously don't need to hit the nuts if you're playing in a 3-man even 100-person contest, it's some of these rules are less important. But in the large field GPPs, when you really need to get like the perfect lineup in there, that's when you need to really worry about those kind of construction issues, having the double stack with the quarterback at captain, that kind of stuff. So yeah, I would prefer, if I have in a large field GPP, if you have either of these quarterbacks in the captain spot, at least double stacking them and always stacking, even if they're in the flex. All right, I think that is enough on the quarterbacks. Let's move on, take a look at the running backs here. So kind of an interesting running back game in general. So we have DeAndre Swift projects the best. We'll start with the Chicago side of the ball. 14 fantasy point projection for DeAndre Swift. Roshan Johnson down at 6.4, and then Khalil Herbert sub 1 fantasy points. Not extremely involved so far this year. In terms of, let's take a look at the projections on Roto Grinders. Travis Etienne projecting for 13 fantasy points. DeAndre Swift 14.6. Sorry, we'll start with just the Chicago side. DeAndre Swift 14.6. Roshan, where are we? I think I missed it. Roshan 6.5, and then Khalil Herbert not going to have 0.5 projection. So DeAndre Swift pretty involved in recent weeks. We can take a look at the bell cow report for the past couple weeks for the Bears. So last week, DeAndre Swift played 68% of snaps, 21 carries in week 5, 2 targets on 51.4% route participation. So honestly, really great usage for DeAndre Swift. Last week, after they talked about, maybe giving Roshan Johnson an extended look, didn't really happen. DeAndre Swift pretty involved last week. The week prior, also 16 carries, saw 7 targets in week 4 on 57.7% route participation. So very involved the past couple weeks in great matchups. Those were, the Rams and Carolina, 2 awesome matchups for a running back. Now another great matchup with Jacksonville. So could just see DeAndre Swift continue to plug along, look great, take advantage of some great matchups here. Roshan Johnson, after they said they were going to give him an extended look prior to week 4, didn't really get that extended look in week 4. Had 7 carries in that game, 0 targets on 23% route participation. So really not that big of a boost in his usage in week 4. Week 5, a little bit better, 25.7% route participation. Had 10 carries in that game. But again, this was just the entire pie was bigger. DeAndre Swift had 21 in that game. So 31 total running back carries in week 5, as opposed to 23 in week 4. So, maybe just the entire pie grew, not, Roshan's actual role within the backfield didn't grow that much relative to DeAndre Swift. And then as far as the matchups go for the Bears, again, for running back position, 3rd best matchup for the Bears here. So another great matchup for the Bears. I guess we can take a look at Jacksonville's matchup before we get into them as well. A pretty middling matchup here, basically league average in terms of schedule adjusted fantasy points allowed to the running back position. So great matchup for Bears running backs, mediocre matchup for Jaguars running backs in this one. Taking a look, so we looked at the flex projection. Let's take a look at the ownership. DeAndre Swift projected for about 35% ownership in the flex. Roshan Johnson down here at 16.5% ownership. He is 5,200. So the price tag does require Roshan to put up, probably double-digit fantasy points. Not necessarily. This could be a low-scoring game, but you're going to need him to do something at 5,200. Can't just be, a 5 fantasy point game. Needs to actually put up a score. I think he's capable of it. Again, 10 carries last week, somewhat involved in the passing game. They did say, the Bears, after the last game, DeAndre Swift got a red zone, I think a goal line carry. And the coaches just said that was just based on the play that they were running. They liked DeAndre Swift for that specific play. So I don't think he's like taking over as the goal line back. I don't think they love DeAndre Swift as a goal line back. So I'm not reading too much into that carry for DeAndre Swift. I do think in general, Roschon Johnson makes more sense there. They said 2 or 3 weeks ago that it was going to be Khalil Herbert at the goal line. We have not seen that come to fruition at all since they said it. So I have no idea why they said it, if they meant it. Seems like BS to me, but who knows? Maybe at some point we will see Khalil Herbert get some of those goal line carries. It makes it sort of interesting if you want to believe them at all, if they, at least intend to use Khalil Herbert at the goal line more. Maybe he makes a little bit of sense at 2.4K. Doesn't project well, but also projected for 1% ownership here. So sort of interesting just as an ownership play. At captain, we have DeAndre Swift coming in at 9% ownership, Roschon Johnson at 1.7, and Khalil Herbert won't get any captain ownership. I think 9% is a pretty good number on DeAndre Swift. I'd probably try to get above that number for DeAndre Swift at captain. Looks good in an elite matchup. Probably not going to Roschon or Khalil Herbert at captain. But I do like DeAndre Swift there. And then in the flex, DeAndre Swift at 35% ownership feels fair to even maybe a little bit light. Again, I think I'm ultimately probably going to be fading the quarterbacks a little bit in favor of some of the position players. I think this could end up being a pretty low scoring game where PPR points, non-touchdown points matter more, and quarterbacks really need some touchdowns to put up high scoring fantasy points. So I think I'm going to lean more into the skill players here than the quarterbacks in general. And I think DeAndre Swift, I'll probably get over that 35% number. Roschon at 16.5% seems about fair. I'll probably be close to that. And then I do think I'll probably get over 1% Khalil Herbert. Like, I think he's pretty interesting. Again, not all that involved in recent weeks. We saw last week just had played 3 total snaps. So that's not all that promising for Khalil Herbert. Didn't play a single snap in week 4. In week 3, though, 8 snaps, had 4 rushing attempts. I believe he did get the goal line carry in week 3. I think that's where, if I'm remembering right, I might be wrong about that, but one of these weeks he had a goal line carry, scored a touchdown. They later said they want to use him as the goal line back. So if you want to believe them, I think he should be rotated in some. I don't know why they're not using him. I do think he is probably their most talented running back. So maybe, I'm holding a candle. I don't know what the terminology is there, but I'm keeping my hopes up for Khalil Herbert to get in there at some point. I think at 1% ownership on a showdown slate in an elite matchup, a couple weeks removed from the coaches saying they want to use him as the goal line back. I think he makes some sense at 2,400. Certainly not a priority because, again, not really being used at all, but at like 0 ownership, I think he's sort of interesting. I'll probably try to get to 5% or so Khalil Herbert, just in case they do finally come back and start playing him a little bit in the goal line, or just giving him more looks. He has a little bit of contingent value. If something happens to either Swift or Roschon, I would expect him to get involved a little bit more. Again, not a high priority. The floor is virtually 0 for Khalil Herbert, but I think kind of interesting at about 1% ownership because I do think he's talented. I think they're sort of inconsistent with their running back usage. So a little bit interesting there. And then as far as the Jaguars go, what did I just do? I think I just X'd out of it. Anyway, as far as the Jaguars go, we have Travis Etienne and Tank Bigsby are the main Jaguars that we'd be interested in. Travis Etienne projected for 13 fantasy points at 36.5% ownership. Tank Bigsby, 7 fantasy points, 18% ownership. Tank Bigsby, man, 7,000. Etienne, 7.4 thousand. Going to be kind of tough to get to Tank Bigsby at 7,000 here against a pretty tough Bears defense. He did have a great game last time out. Looking at the bell cow report, just looking at the usage for these two, we have Tank Bigsby played 37% of snaps, saw 13 carries, has not really been involved in the passing game at all this year. 1 target last week. Travis Etienne, 7 targets last week. That's really nice. 44% rep participation. Only had 6 carries in the game, but not reading too much into the carries here. The coaches did come out after the game and say that Travis Etienne was limited in the second half by his shoulder injury. He should be good to go for this game. So not, um, so I think we could see Travis Etienne take on, a heavier workload again. The week prior in week 4, we saw Travis Etienne had 11 carries. Again, 34% route participation. I guess only saw 2 targets in that game, but 6 targets a week prior to that. In general, has a pretty solid workload. Tank Bigsby has been the better runner so far this year, just hasn't been as good in the passing game. They did say coaches were asked, Doug Peterson was asked like directly, is Tank Bigsby taking over this backfield? Is he going to be the lead back? And he said, no, Travis Etienne is our guy. Bigsby has been great, but basically made clear that Travis Etienne is their preferred running back. They certainly trust him more in the passing game. So I don't really see Tank Bigsby taking over there. I think I guess the reason to potentially play Tank Bigsby would be if you think Travis Etienne is still pretty limited. He has been very good as a runner. But since he's not really involved in the passing game at all, really tough matchup. It's going to be tougher for Tank Bigsby to get there. Whereas Travis Etienne has the out of just like picking up 5 or 6 receptions and getting their kind of PPR scamming his way there. I don't really see that in Tank Bigsby's range of outcomes. Has not really shown much in the passing game. I think on the entire year, let's see, Tank Bigsby 1 target through 5 games on 7.7% route participation. So he really needs to put up a touchdown and or many yards to get there, and that's gonna be tough against this Bears team. They're a pretty solid defense, I guess, middling against the run, so it is one of the easier ways to attack them, but still just overall a pretty good Bears defense. Gonna be easier for ETN to get there than Bigsby. And the ownership sort of reflects that, but I don't think it really fully reflects the range of outcomes. At 7.4K for ETN, I think the gap should be wider in ownership here, 36.5% to 18%. I'll probably be lightly fading Bigsby, definitely more interested in ETN. Bigsby does have, obviously the contingent upside. If ETN goes down, it's going to be Bigsby getting a lot of work. But again, still not going to be too involved in the passing game. Still pretty expensive. He's not really priced appropriately for his role. I'd have more interest at like 5,000. Then suddenly the contingent upside would look really good. But 7,000 probably not going to get to a ton of Tank Bigsby. But I do like ETN. 36.5% ownership looks pretty good. A captain, definitely not going to Bigsby for me. 8% ownership on ETN. I think that looks okay. I like the Swift ownership better because the matchup is so much better. But I think 8% actually looks pretty good for ETN. I might come on overweight to that also. Again, probably Swift the bigger priority, but I think I could see myself coming in over 8% ETN again at the expense of the quarterbacks. I'm probably just going to be kind of lightly fading the quarterbacks. Okay. I think that does it. I think that's all that we need to talk about with the running backs. I closed a tab here, so I'll just skip over. I guess we don't really need that tab. Anyway, we'll move on and talk about wide receivers here. 1 second. All right, so let's start with the Bears side. DJ Moore projected for 16 fantasy points, 34% ownership in the flex. Keenan Allen projected for 13 fantasy points, 31% ownership in the flex. Rome Odunze projected for 11 fantasy points, 25.5% ownership in the flex. Rome 7.2K, Keenan Allen 7.6K, DJ Moore 9.8K. So a big difference in price there between DJ Moore and the other two. I think those are the only 3 Bears that I'm particularly interested in playing. Actually, let me look at the last week's report. Yeah, each of these guys, 88.6% route participation. Pretty interesting to see that they were all even in terms of route participation. We were kind of expecting coming into the year that it was going to be Keenan Allen and DJ Moore in 2 wide receiver sets. Rome Odunze only coming in as a 3rd receiver would see less of a workload. But honestly, the route participation has been pretty good from the start for Rome Odunze. 8 targets last week for Moore, 6 targets each for Keenan Allen and Rome Odunze. Yeah, no other wide receivers even ran a route last week. So yeah, you can just stick to the big three for the Bears. Obviously, some contingent upside there for who would it be? Let's in week 3 we had Keenan Allen out. In week 3 we saw Colin Johnson played 2 snaps out. DeAndre Carter would be the likeliest. I believe he's also on the injury report, so something to note there. But regardless, only contingent upside there. Really, the big three are the only three that are likely to see any real playing time here. And obviously, great matchups for all three of the Bears receivers. Looking at schedule adjusted fantasy points allowed. Jacksonville allowing 16.3 fantasy points more per game than you would expect based on their schedule. That is massive. That is the most in the league. So elite matchup for Bears receivers. They are going to be a big priority. Whereas again, Jacksonville receivers is the bottom 3 matchup in the league. We only get to choose from this one game, but obviously the Bears receivers look pretty good here. I like that 34% ownership on DJ Moore. I like the 31% ownership on Keenan Allen. I like the 25.5% on Rome Odunze. I'll probably honestly be overweight to all three of them. Again, partially at the expense of the quarterbacks. We'll see if we can maybe fade the Jacksonville receivers a little bit too. But yeah, I have interest in all three of the Bears receivers. Maybe even more interest in the Bears receivers than Travis Etienne. I could see myself coming in underweight to 36.5% Etienne. I don't know. He's cheap enough that maybe I'd take that back. I still kind of think that is fair ownership on Etienne. Look for other ways to fade. But yeah, the Bears receivers all look pretty awesome and not getting a crazy amount of ownership here. A captain with DJ Moore, 10% projected ownership. Keenan Allen, 7%. Rome Odunze, 4.6%. Yeah, I think 10% on DJ Moore, probably a little bit light. Keenan Allen, 7%. I don't know who I like the best here. I mean, 5% Rome Odunze, 4.6% looks pretty interesting to me. He's the cheapest. 6 targets last week. Has looked pretty good. So maybe I think he's the one that I'm pretty clearly going to be coming overweight on. Again, though, might come in overweight on all of the Bears receivers and just, I mean, I might end up strongly fading. I've been saying lightly fading the quarterbacks. I might end up strongly fading the quarterbacks because pretty interested in these numbers. At least Trevor Lawrence, I think I might just full fade at captain. Caleb, I think I have to at least consider there given the great matchup, but probably end up overweight on all of the Bears receivers. Love the matchups there. Yeah, best possible, and then not getting a crazy high amount of ownership. As far as the Jaguars receivers go, again, bottom 3 matchup in terms of schedule adjusted fantasy points so far this year. So not great matchups. In captain ownership, we have Brian Thomas Jr. coming in at 6.5%. See, I'd rather just go to probably the Bears receivers than Brian Thomas Jr. I think this is not a bad number, but not like standing out as a great number in a bad matchup. Christian Kirk at 4%, and then Gabe Davis coming in at 2%. I think Gabe Davis might be the one that I end up leaning into just a little bit, just because he has that kind of boom bust profile. This is a game where nobody's really guaranteed to do much for the Jaguars against this really tough Bears defense. So maybe just lean into Gabe Davis, hoping for that kind of broken play at captain at 2% is at least sort of interesting. In the flex, we have Brian Thomas Jr., 31%. Yeah, see, I just prefer DJ Moore here. If they're going to be close in terms of ownership, close in terms of salary, I'll lean into the guys that have the much better matchup. So maybe a light fade there on Brian Thomas Jr., even though I really like him, really believe in the talent, just given the matchup and the close ownership, probably lean into the Bears side. Keenan Allen, coming in at about the same ownership, much cheaper. So I prefer Keenan Allen to Brian Thomas Jr. Yeah, I'm just going to prefer the Bears side in general. Christian Kirk, I mean, 24% ownership for Christian Kirk is pretty interesting. He is 8.4K, so more expensive than his teammates. Makes it a little bit tougher, but 24% feels pretty fair. And then Gabe Davis coming in at 19% ownership at 4.4K. Again, I think I'm going to lean into Gabe Davis a little bit more in this game. He hasn't really done much, so the ownership makes sense for Gabe Davis. But just looking at the numbers from last week, the usage for the Jaguars receivers last week, Gabe Davis, 82.4% route participation, actually led the receivers. Brian Thomas Jr., 79.4%. Christian Kirk down to 70.6%. So overall, I mean, 4 targets for Gabe Davis is not elite usage. He has not been great so far this year, but he's always been a pretty boom bust player. So now that we get him pretty cheap price tag, low ownership, I do have some interest there. Week 4, again, 77% route participation, 5 targets. So he is getting some opportunities. I think I might just lean into that a little bit. Not taking a huge stand there because I don't want him to entirely like make or break my day. Pretty high ADOT here for Gabe Davis. Let's see, for the season, what do we have? Gabe Davis, actually, they're pretty similar. 13.5 ADOT. Christian Kirk, 13.3. Brian Thomas, 13 ADOT. Just 159 yards on the season for Gabe Davis. It's kind of what you expect, though. Like you're not counting on Gabe Davis. He's never going to be super consistent. But given the boom bust nature of his game, he's being targeted a fair amount, 25 targets, 5 targets per game so far this year. If he just connects on one of those, scores a touchdown, which we know he's capable of doing, yeah, I think he's pretty interesting at a relatively low price tag here, relatively low ownership. So I do think I'm going to be overweight to Gabe Davis, all things considered. Probably a little bit underweight to Brian Thomas, even though, again, nearly 400 yards here. He's been awesome, just really great as a rookie. But price tag is pretty high. The matchup is really tough. So all things considered, probably just leaning into the guy who needs a little bit less to get there in Gabe Davis. Christian Kirk's ownership, I think, is fine. I guess the other note would be Parker Washington a couple weeks ago. I think maybe 2 games ago before the game, they said they need to get Parker Washington involved more. They really haven't. 5 routes run last week, 14.7% route participation. The week prior to that, Parker Washington, actually better than I thought. 10 routes run, 28.6% route participation. So who knows? Maybe they do want to get him involved a little bit more. You could think about Parker Washington. Probably my favorite of the, there's kind of the big 3 on both of these teams, counting Gabe Davis as part of the big 3. Outside of those top 6 receivers, I think Parker Washington is the most interesting to me at 1,000, projecting for 1.6 fantasy points, about 4% ownership. Don't hate that number. I think Parker Washington is probably the most interesting, again, with Doug Peterson coming out saying we need to get him on the field more. They've sort of done it a little bit the past couple weeks. I don't know, sort of interesting at 1,000. Has some standalone value, and then obviously has contingent upside if anybody gets hurt during the game. So some interest there for me in Parker Washington as a tertiary option. All right, tight ends. We have Evan Ingram is likely, I don't think it's even guaranteed yet at this point, but is likely to return for this game. 26% ownership, projected for about 10 fantasy points. Matchup is pretty good. It doesn't stand out as an elite matchup in terms of schedule adjusted fantasy points allowed relative to other Jaguars, but not a huge concern for me. Pretty middling matchup for both Jacksonville and Chicago in terms of schedule adjusted for the tight ends. Yeah, nothing standing out there, but the ownership looks okay on Evan Ingram. I think you could still consider Brenton Strange here. 3.2K. Who knows? Maybe Evan Ingram a little bit limited. Brenton Strange has been getting pretty solid usage with Evan Ingram out. Last week, up to 82% route participation, 4 targets. He's had pretty solid usage. Week 4, his usage or his route participation was a little bit down, just 28% in. Sorry, that's not him. Brenton Strange, 46% in week 4. So that was kind of concerning, but popped back up last week. I think you can consider him just in case Evan Ingram is limited. If Evan Ingram is out, then he becomes very interesting. Then I would have a lot of interest in Brenton Strange. But I think Evan Ingram trending toward playing at this point, even with Ingram in. I think Brenton Strange, as just like a dart throw, probably not going to see a lot of action, but maybe gets more than we expect at low ownership. A decent enough low owned play. Evan Ingram, I think solid, not a huge priority there, but solid enough play at 26% ownership, 5.8K. Yeah, some interest there. On the Chicago side, Cole Kmet has taken over as a clear tight end 1, projected for 9 fantasy points. 18% ownership. I like it. I'm going to lean into Cole Kmet a little bit too. Again, I think I'm just kind of leaning into the Chicago side of this game, just a much better matchup. the ownership not really reflecting the disparity in the matchup. So 6.6K, I like it. 19% ownership for Cole Kmet. I would imagine I get over that number. Gerald Everett, we saw him week one, had a big role, has not really had a huge role since week one, projects for 2.6 fantasy points, 5% ownership. That seems fair to me. I'll probably get over 5%. Again, great matchup. Some, usage every week. Last week we saw, here, I'll pull up the Bears. Last week, 17% route participation. Did see 2 targets in that game, so you can probably expect him to see a couple targets most games. He didn't see any in week 4. In week 3, Gerald Everett, just 1 target on 21% route participation. Honestly, basically just the standard backup tight end, hope for a touchdown, some contingent upside in case Cole Kmet gets hurt, but not a huge priority there. All right, we are close to half an hour already, so I need to over half an hour already. All right, so I'll move on. We did tight ends, defenses, and kickers. It all comes down to ownership here. So let's take a look at ownership. Bears coming in at 17%. I like that number for the Bears at $4,000, 17% ownership. Yeah, I'll lean into that. I like that better than Jaguars 17.5% at 3.6K. I don't hate that either. Going up against a rookie quarterback in London seems like a fair spot, even for a bad defense. I don't hate the idea of having Caleb Williams and the Jaguars in a lineup together, or actually Trevor Lawrence and the Bears defense. Totally like this spot for playing defenses and quarterbacks in the same game, in the same lineup, rather. As far as the kickers go, Cam Little coming in 17.5%, Cairo Santos 17%. Expensive enough that neither of those numbers really stands out to me. I'll probably end up a little bit overweight, as I usually am, 2 kickers, but not a huge priority there. Maybe I'll shoot for 20% ownership on each of these kickers and just leave it at that. They tend to go a little bit under owned, but the price tags have come up enough that they don't stand out as great value plays. I actually think I like the defense is better. So I'm going to make it a priority to be overweight on the defenses. The kicker is not a huge priority for me. If I end up underweight, I'm probably going to be fine with that. Not a huge stand there. All right, I think that is going to do it. I don't have time to make a lineup right now because I've got a live show coming up in 5 minutes. So that is going to do it for this video. Thank you for watching. Again, if you haven't already done so, please do like the video, subscribe to the YouTube channel, comment. All of that is very helpful for the algo. I will be back on this channel for Sunday Night Football, 90 minutes prior to lock on Sunday night. So hopefully I'll see you there. All right. Thanks, guys. I'll catch you later.